Good evening and welcome to the 2020 annual lecture of the Centre for Law and the Environment. I'm Stephen Vaughan, one of the professors in the Faculty of Laws, and with Professor Maria Lee, I co-direct the centre. I'm delighted you're here to join us this annual lecture, and our format for this evening is as follows. I'll say a few words in a moment about our speaker, Professor Joanne Scott. Joanne's then going to talk for around 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Some of you have already kindly sent in questions. I've got those here in front of me. And for everyone else, please feel free to add any additional questions into the Q&A box on Zoom. I'll be monitoring the Q&A during the talk, and then we'll pass those questions on to Joanne at the end of her talk. Now, this Centre for Law and the Environment annual lecture series was launched in 2015. It's meant to be a platform for showcasing contemporary environmental law scholarship. While the pandemic means that we're online tonight, that does have two advantages. One is that we're joined by people all over the world. So I looked at the invite list and I can see people in Chile, in Mexico, in Canada, Australia, Japan. You're all very welcome to join us this evening. And the second advantage is that for those who are in the UK, there's a very neat and easy segue from Joanne's talk to the finale of the Great British Bake Off, which is at 8 p.m. on Channel 4. There's a little note in my thing here saying pause for laughter. I'm just assuming you're all laughing at home. So our speaker this evening is Professor Joanne Scott of the European University Institute in Florence. She has various areas of expertise: European Union law, WTO law, climate law, environmental law, published widely on law and governance. And prior to her appointment, Professor Scott was Professor of European law here at UCL. She was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy in 2013 and as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2012. Now, they're all things you could have Googled for yourselves. Let me just say one more thing, a bit more personal. When you are, like Joanne, an academic giant, when your work is thoughtful, rigorous, foundational, and read all over the world, you have a choice about how you act. You can either expect people to treat you like an academic superstar, which you are, or you can be kind, compassionate, interested in developing your students' and your colleagues' careers, and an all-round wonderful person in the field. Joanne is, of course, the latter. She has been a brilliant mentor to me personally, and I know to many of you on this call this evening. So I am delighted for personal and professional reasons that we have Joanne here for the 2020 annual lecture. Joanne's going to speak to us about a very topical issue, the EU's global environmental land use footprint in relation to the emergence of certain types of disease. Joanne, over to you. So pleased you could join us.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Stephen. I have to admit to being slightly relieved that you didn't describe me as the first type of academic. It's very nice to be with you and lots of other friends and colleagues. And I know there are students, former students, current students, so it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm sitting in my study in the Casentino, which is a little known area of Tuscany, where the River Arno rises, and there's an extensive forest which is comprised mainly of beech. And if I turn a little blue during my lecture, it's because our plumber has COVID-19 and we've not yet been able, therefore, to have our heating installed. So it's just a tad on the chilly side. We are currently living through the first high mortality global pandemic since the emergence of HIV/AIDS. Both HIV/AIDS and COVID-19 are zoonotic diseases caused by viruses that have spilled over from animals to humans. Chimpanzees for HIV type 1 and sooty mangabees for HIV type 2. Slide 3, please, Lisa. I had to look up what a sooty mangabee actually was. Bats, probably via an intermediary host species for COVID-19. It is estimated that around 75% of all new and emerging infectious diseases jump species from animals to humans, with most making the leap through insect vectors, intermediary species, or the food system. Although domesticated animal species have shared a much larger number of viruses with people than wildlife, these domestic animals normally act as bridges or amplifying hosts for pathogens that originate in wild animals. For example, while bats are the natural reservoir species for the Nipah virus, pigs reared in intensive hog farms in Malaysia have served as the intermediate host. The frequency of zoonotic disease emergence is increasing globally, and there is a considerable discussion about why this might be the case. Put simply, it is due to increasing contact between species, humans, livestock, and wildlife. Slide 4. The increasing contact is in turn thought to be driven by two principal factors. First, there is a clearly established link between deforestation and virus emergence. Deforestation creates patchwork forests with longer perimeters or forest edges, thereby expanding the transition zone between forest and non-forest that serves as a springboard for novel viruses. Deforestation activities such as farming, mining, and timber production, and a growing presence of humans and livestock at forest edges facilitates the zoonotic leap. Second, trade in wild animals, including hunting, slaughter, warehousing, transportation, and sale, brings people and animals, as well as different kinds of animals, into close proximity. The possible role of the Wuhan wet market in facilitating transmission of coronavirus between species and/or virus spread continues to be debated. The recent pandemics report published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services highlights research that shows that the infection of wild animals may occur or increase as they progress through the wildlife trade value chain. As our understanding of the causes of zoonotic diseases increases, it becomes possible to identify so-called emerging infectious disease hotspots. Slide 5, please, Lisa. Allen et al. Have observed the risk of disease emergence is elevated in tropical forest regions, which are high in mammal biodiversity and experiencing anthropogenic land use change related to agricultural practices. But they go on to say, areas of higher suitability for emerging infectious disease occurrence are fairly evenly distributed across the continents, with no major landmass free from areas predicted to be suitable for them. In particular, areas of high population outside of the tropics, including cities in Europe, remain among the areas at the high end of the disease risk index. There is widespread agreement today that a One Health, quote, approach is necessary to reduce risks associated with zoonotic diseases. Slide 6, please. This approach rests on the key premise that human, animal, and ecosystem health are interdependent, and that therefore achieving a high level of protection requires close collaboration between different disciplines at all levels of governance. It lays emphasis on the importance of monitoring disease risk and on the rapid containment of the emergence of zoonotic pathogens. The concept of One Health has been given institutional expression at the international level through a partnership, a memorandum of understanding, between the World Organization for Animal Health, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and the World Health Organization. While widely endorsed and increasingly practiced, the One Health approach has also been criticized. For example, in exploring the structural drivers of vulnerability to zoonotic diseases in Africa, Zingire, slide 7 please, and her colleagues describe One Health as technocratic and anti-political in its emphasis on institutional and interdisciplinary collaboration. Through 3 case studies, they seek to show how political interests, commercial investments, and securitization, for example, contribute to disease emergence and transmission and create patterns of vulnerability, including for people displaced by infrastructure, commercial expansion of agriculture, and elite conservation initiatives. It is therefore only by historicizing our understanding of disease that we can identify the structural as opposed to the proximate drivers of disease emergence and transmission, and understand the competing interests and trade-offs at stake. In a somewhat similar vein, Robert Wallace and his colleagues have proposed a dawn of structural One Health, a new science tracking disease emergence along circuits of capital. Slide 8, please, Lisa. They propose a more spatial or relational approach to zoonotic disease emergence that rejects One Health, and I'm quoting here, confounding of the place where a pathogen emerges with the geography of causality. By following the circuits of capital that finance the kinds of development and production that drive disease emergence, for example, deforestation, New York, London, and Hong Kong become the world's pandemic hotspots, rather than the tropical forest areas identified in Allen's map. With this new science, the authors suggest, it becomes possible to test hypotheses that link the globalization of land through international trade and investment with pathogen emergence and spread. How globalized land is viewed as being depends on which land is framed as being in motion, to use Luke Bergman's words. Luke Bergman is one of the authors of the structural One Health approach. Bergman gives the following example. Is the land used to produce a bowl of rice eaten for lunch by a worker in the Pearl River Delta to be included in the characterization of land that is globalized or not? What about the land that is used to generate electricity that powers a factory, making manufactured goods that are produced in one country but consumed in another? I forgot to put a slide with Bergman's article on the PowerPoint. So if you just Google Luke Bergman, land in motion, you'll find his article. And if you don't, let me know and I will send you the site. Taking inspiration from structural One Health, I want to highlight today the nature and degree of the responsibility that we within Europe bear in relation to practices that create a heightened risk of disease emergence, and to explore what the EU is doing and is considering doing to reduce the scale of this responsibility. My focus will be on deforestation. Let me start by presenting data provided by colleagues in Vienna who have estimated the scale of the EU's global environmental footprint. Slide 9, please. These data are consumption-based and identify which environmental pressures generated by EU consumption of goods and services are felt outside of the EU's territory. They reveal the extent to which the EU depends on emissions or extractions of environmental resources in other world regions. The table summarizes the EU 28's per capita environmental footprint in 2015, the EU 28 as was in 2015. Compares this to the global average and shows what percentage of each footprint category is comprised of non-territorial emissions or extractions. Non-territorial emissions or extractions of environmental resources are labeled as foreign share, 31% in the case of land. This table shows, and again I quote, Europe is currently living on emission and resource credits provided by other parts of the world. More specifically, in relation to deforestation, a study prepared on behalf of the European Commission observes that between 1990 and 2008, so the data is somewhat out of date, the EU 28 consumed 1/3 of globally traded agricultural products associated with deforestation. Extrapolating from this, the study suggests that in terms of its consumption footprint, the EU bears responsibility for 10% of worldwide deforestation that is associated with the production of goods and services. With the growth of China as a market for forest risk commodities, it may well be that this figure of 10% is too high. Nonetheless, while a recent study acknowledges that China continues to pull ahead of the EU as a market for forest risk commodities such as soy, beef, and palm oil, Europe not only remains a major importer, but it has the highest exposure to deforestation embodied in the imports of any consumer region from 2005 to 2013. This is because some EU imports of forest risk commodities are associated with more deforestation per ton than those imported by e.g. China. Viewed in terms of embodied deforestation, calculated not just on the basis of the sheer tonnage of imports, but also in light of the relative rate of deforestation risk embodied in imports. Slide 10, please, Lisa. 36% of embodied deforestation consumed in Europe comes from what they call cattle meat, which I assume is beef, and 61% from forestry products such as timber, wood pulp, and paper. If we then turn from consumption to finance, the circuits of capital in the language of structural One Health. Campaigning NGOs have long been active in seeking to expose links between financial institutions and deforestation. Global Witness's 2019 article, Money to Burn, offers an impressive example. Based on a report prepared by the Dutch research and advice consultancy Profundo, this article claims that more than 600 banks and investors injected capital to the tune of $44 billion in 6 of the world's most destructive agribusinesses between 2013 and 2019. Many of the financial institutions involved are established within the European Union and the UK, as slide 11, please, Lisa, shows. Also significantly, TRACE, which stands for Transparency for Sustainable Economics, which is a collaboration between the Stockholm Environment Institute and Global Canopy, is expanding its activities from mapping commodity value chains, including their associated deforestation risk, to developing the Trace Finance database, which seeks to link financial institutions to deforestation risk. The database is currently marked as a beta project undergoing testing, and for the present only includes soy and beef from Brazil and palm oil from Indonesia. It identifies the commodity traders, equity holders, bond holders, and lenders with the greatest direct and indirect exposure to deforestation risk associated with the export of the current commodities. A significant number of European financial institutions are identified as being exposed to deforestation risk. To take just one random example on slide 12, please, Lisa, BNP Paribas and various of its subsidiaries are exposed in relation to all 3 of the commodities so far included in Trace Finance. It is exposed both through its direct connections with trading companies, e.g. Wilmar International in Singapore, and as a result of its indirect and somewhat attenuated sometimes relationships with agribusinesses involved in the production of the commodities concerned. So what has the EU done in a bid to reduce the EU's land use footprint, including its deforestation footprint? So far, its main focus has been on timber and timber products imported into the EU. In relation to timber, the EU has adopted a novel, promising, but challenging approach that consists of 2 principal elements. First, the EU Timber Regulation, the EUTR, prohibits the placing of illegally harvested timber and timber products on the EU market, with illegality being understood as contravention of the applicable legislation of the country where the timber is harvested. Slide 13, please. In order to ensure compliance with this legislation, operators placing timber on the EU market for the first time are required to exercise due diligence and to maintain and regularly evaluate their due diligence, the due diligence system that it uses. Due diligence requires the gathering of detailed value chain information, risk assessment, and risk mitigation measures to minimize risks of illegally harvested timber being placed on the EU market. Operators may develop their own due diligence system, or they may choose to use an off-the-peg version developed by a monitoring organization that has been approved by the EU. Responsibility for enforcement lies principally in the hands of the member state competent authorities, although infringement actions brought against the member states by the European Commission have played an important role. Additional checks may be conducted by competent authorities when third parties raise substantiated concerns about an operator's compliance with the regulation. This includes third parties outside of the EU. There is some evidence that some elements of national legislation are more actively enforced than other parts, and we can see this from slide 14, which I'll let you take a look at yourselves. The second key element of the EU's timber regime takes the form of voluntary partnership agreements that are concluded between the EU and timber producing countries. These bilateral agreements are negotiated within the framework of the EU's Forest Law Enforcement and Governance Initiative, FLEGT, and they set out an agreed definition of legality for timber production. These voluntary partnership agreements require third countries to establish a timber legality assurance system so that timber can be certified as meeting this standard. Both the negotiation of the agreements and the implementation of the agreements is intended to be conducted within the framework of an inclusive, multi-stakeholder process involving civil society and business, as well as governmental actors. Timber that is certified under a VPA, Voluntary Partnership Agreement, can be fast-tracked into the EU market without the operator in question having to demonstrate due diligence under the timber regulation. While it is challenging and time-consuming to negotiate such voluntary partnership agreements, this partnership approach forms an indispensable element of improved forest governance for reasons which have been set out in a recent Fern report, slide 15. Fern is a wonderful NGO which focuses on forest conservation issues. As slide 15 notes, deforestation is a wicked problem, an academic term for a problem that cannot be framed and understood in linear cause, symptom, effect relationships. It is a problem that evolves unpredictably over time, that involves conflicts of values among different stakeholder groups. These problems cannot be addressed by simple commitments such as removing bad products from supply chains or providing more development aid. They require governance approaches instigating deep and broad systemic change. The status of the VPA negotiations is shown on slide 16. I just need to check, is that the table with this? Yeah, we're doing okay. Yeah, I got muddled with my slides here. You'll see that there are a number of negotiations that have been concluded, a couple of agreements that have been initialed, and negotiations are ongoing with several other countries. Taken together, these 15 countries cover 79% of global trade in tropical wood products. Despite the relative and increasing success of the EU's efforts to restrict imports of illegal timber and to cooperate with third countries in promoting improvements in forest governance, the Commission has acknowledged the importance of stepping up EU action to protect and restore the world's forests. This is the title of a 2019 Commission communication. This communication sets out 5 priorities, the first of which is to reduce the EU's consumption footprint on land and to encourage the consumption of products from deforestation-free supply chains. The Commission is committed to assessing the need for additional demand-side regulatory and non-regulatory measures to minimize the risk of deforestation and forest degradation associated with imports into the EU. It currently has a consultation open, which will contribute to an impact assessment, investigating the suitability of a range of different demand-side measures. The consultation is open until December the 10th, and for a formal proposal for legislation is expected in the first half of next year. While it is impossible to know at this stage what is likely to emerge, it seems that the timber model of combining voluntary partnership agreements with the due diligence requirements could well provide a basis on which to build. So, for example, we may well see proposals to extend voluntary partnership agreements beyond timber to other forest and ecosystem risk commodities. Such agreements should ideally go beyond legality to encompass sustainability, given the scale and urgency of the problem. Such agreements would be even more challenging to conclude, not least because it is clear that at least some of the countries that are the major suppliers of forest and ecosystem risk commodities to the EU will not be willing to enter into an agreement of this kind. Brazil is perhaps the clearest example under the Bolsonaro leadership. It seems, therefore, that in addition to forest risk commodity VPAs, the concept of due diligence will continue to assume considerable importance moving forward. And as some of you will be aware, on 22nd of October this year, the European Parliament adopted a resolution, including recommendations to the Commission on an EU legal framework to halt and reverse EU-driven global deforestation. Slide 17, please, Lisa. And if you look at the left-hand side. The European Parliament is proposing that access to the EU market for forest and ecosystem risk commodities should be subject to operators fulfilling a due diligence obligation. They would be required to ensure that there is no more than a negligible risk that such commodities originate from land obtained via the conversion or degradation of natural forests or other natural ecosystems. And products must not be produced in or linked to violations of human rights. Operators would be required to demonstrate this both within their own activities and in relation to the business relationships they have with business partners and entities along their entire value chain: transport companies, suppliers, traders, franchisees, licensees, joint ventures, and so on. The European Parliament acknowledges the importance of definitions and states that any proposal must distinguish between forests on the one hand and natural forests on the other, with only the latter possessing many or most of the characteristics of forests specific to a given region. Significantly, in terms of what the European Parliament is suggesting, financial institutions that are authorized to operate within the EU, providing finance, investment, insurance, or other services to operators engaged in the supply chain of commodities, would also have a responsibility to undertake due diligence to ensure that supply chain companies are respecting the obligations laid down in this proposal. The European Parliament suggests that due diligence be enforced by way of public enforcement and civil liability. As far as public enforcement is concerned, Member States shall establish competent authorities with responsibility for enforcement and effective, proportionate, and dissuasive penalties. These shall be proportionate to the damage caused, the costs of restoration, and the economic prejudice suffered by affected communities. Amongst the penalties to be included is suspension of EU market access. As far as civil liability is concerned, operators shall be jointly and severally liable for harm that has been caused by controlled or economically dependent entities. Operators will likewise be liable for harm directly linked to their products through a business relationship, unless they can show that they have acted with due care and taken all reasonable measures given the circumstances that could have prevented the harm. What is clear is the suggestion that the European Parliament is putting forward, and it's not even a formal Commission proposal at this stage, is that the concept of due diligence in this proposal is much broader and much more ambitious than the concept of due diligence in the timber regulation, which we talked about before. While in the timber regulation, the benchmark for due diligence is legality, here the benchmark is a no more than negligible risk of conversion or degradation of natural forests or ecosystems. Whereas the timber regulation applies only to timber, the European Parliament text would apply to a much broader list of commodities still to be determined, but at least including palm oil, soy, meat, leather, cocoa, coffee, rubber, and maize, including products derived from or containing these commodities. The provisions on civil liability are new and important. The inclusion of financial institutions is key. There is much more emphasis here on human rights, crucially including the land tenure rights of local communities and indigenous peoples in all forms, including customary rights. Commodities must not be obtained from lands of indigenous people or local communities, the proposal suggests, without obtaining their free, prior, and informed consent. This is highly significant given that a very high proportion of tropical forest concessions involve land inhabited by indigenous people or local indigenous people or local communities. Be aware that there is also a second proposal for a more generic corporate due diligence measure, which is doing the rounds. This is the right-hand slide of slide 17, so still the same slide. This also includes human rights, environment, and governance risks. And draft legislation in relation to this second, more generic due diligence proposal is also expected to be tabled in the first half next year. People talk about this proposal as the Eurojust proposal. In the meantime, the European Parliament's Committee on Legal Affairs has adopted a resolution, including a proposed text also in relation to this second proposal. This is a much more generic proposal. It's not related to market access, EU market access for specific proposals. I'm not going to spend time talking about it. But for those of you who are interested in corporate governance and also private international law, this second proposal is also interesting and important. For example, it suggests that European courts could conceivably play the role of forums of necessity in the event that access to justice is denied in third countries. So from a private international law point of view, this is a really interesting proposal. Okay, going on to the last part of my lecture, in keeping with the title, to consider the possibilities and limits of EU action. As a starting point, let me say that I consider the EU's external actions on timber to be justified. I also consider the new due diligence proposal put forward by the European Parliament, which goes beyond legality. It's getting a thing saying my internet is unstable, but hopefully it will continue, towards a no more than negligible risk approach in relation to forests and ecosystems to be appropriate. I consider the new proposal to be appropriate. This new proposal is ambitious but narrow in the sense that it only applies to operators importing forest risk and ecosystem risk commodities into the EU and to financial institutions which finance their activities. Unlike voluntary partnership agreements, which are based on third country consent, the European Parliament's due diligence text does not seek to achieve systemic forest governance reform within third countries. How might these existing and proposed market-based measures be justified? I will make just two brief comments, though there's much more that could be said. First, on the basis that they are necessary to avoid the EU and consumers within the EU being complicit in wrongdoing in third countries, complicit in the sense of making a potentially essential causal contribution to this wrongdoing. This argument from complicity is easier to make where there is a shared standard for identifying what counts as wrongdoing. Legality, for example, by reference to third country law, or international standards pertaining to the protection of human rights. While I have relied on the concept of complicity as a rationale for EU action in previous writings, slide 18, please, Lisa. On further reflection, I think perhaps it lets the EU too easily off the hook. After all, the concept of complicity implies that the EU has secondary responsibility for wrongdoing, while primary responsibility rests elsewhere. Perhaps, however, the primary wrongdoing should be viewed as occurring within the EU as a result of our unsustainable and excessive consumption of forest and ecosystem risk commodities. Having set out the scale of the EU's land and deforestation footprint earlier in the lecture, I probably don't need to elaborate on this more. But to bolster the argument, it is also worth observing that the EU has been found to have exceeded its share of the planet's safe operating space for land system change. Slide 19, please, Lisa. Even when it seemed to have exceeded this share, even when the EU share is calculated on an equal per capita basis, which is a very EU-friendly way of understanding fairness, given the EU's historically high responsibility for deforestation and its high level of economic development. What, though, of the possible limitations that could threaten to inhibit the EU's capacity to serve as a catalyst for change in relation to activities that increase the risk of zoonotic disease emergence, specifically deforestation and wildlife change. Again, I will highlight only two, though undoubtedly there are others that exist. The first concerns the extent of the EU's market power. The EU is a significant market for forest and ecosystem risk commodities, but it is one among several significant markets. Its market power varies widely between commodities and depends not only on the volume of its imports, but the ease with which trade can be diverted to other world regions. One also has to acknowledge that there are circumstances in which producer nations exercise market power vis-à-vis the EU. This is a point that Duncan Brack has made when thinking about the usefulness of the illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing model of regulation in relation to cocoa, which is a forest risk commodity imported into the EU. Slide 20, please. He points out that there are at least 91 countries that export fish to Europe, and that the EU can therefore clamp down harshly on individual countries found to be engaging in illegal fishing. And indeed, the EU has done so with positive effects. However, in the case of cocoa, EU imports are dominated by two countries, Ghana and the Côte d'Ivoire. This is a quote. Any ban on imports of cocoa from either of these countries, and particularly from Côte d'Ivoire, would have hugely disruptive effects, would be hugely disruptive to EU-based company supply chains. We know from the general literature about the global reach of EU law that the EU can sometimes punch above its weight. Anu Bradford's famous Brussels effect uses the concept of non-divisible standards to explain why companies in third countries sometimes decide to comply with EU law, even in circumstances when they're not legally required to do so. In my writing, I developed the concept of firm level and country level territorial extension to help explain how the EU sometimes uses its market power to make regulatory demands on firms in third countries, even as regards activities that are not directly tied to sales within the EU. In relation to the subject matter of this lecture, Jonathan Zeitland and Christine Overdevest, slide 21 please, left-hand side, have pieced together a fascinating account of how the EU timber regulation has generated a norm cascade leading to the emergence of a joined-up transnational timber legality regime. They show how the EU FLEGT Forest Law Enforcement Governance Action Plan encouraged US NGOs to push for the amendment of US law to include plants and timber within its scope, and how this US amendment in turn fueled political support for the adoption of the timber regulation within the EU. Taken together, the US and the EU legislation generated a norm cascade leading to the adoption of timber legality legislation by other major importers such as Australia, Japan, and South Korea. Although China, which is the biggest importer and exporter of timber, and whose companies are still reported to be engaged in illegal logging activities abroad, has not yet adopted timber legality legislation, the fact that more than 70% of China's wood exports by value are destined for countries which do have such legislation in place has generated a stronger commitment on the Chinese government and private companies within China to tackle illegal logging. The Chinese government is reported to be collaborating with the EU and the UK with the aim of constructing a timber legality verification system. Zeitland and Overdevest argue that their paper provides robust new evidence for the claim that a joined-up transnational regime can be assembled piece by piece under polyarchic conditions through coordinated learning from decentralized experimentation, without, they claim, the need for a hegemonic power to impose common global rules. There is likewise evidence that the EU's prohibition on the importation of wild birds, enacted on a provisional basis in 2005 and made permanent in 2007, which was driven by fears of the spread of avian flu, has led to a dramatic reduction in the worldwide volume of trade in wild birds. Still slide 21 on the right-hand side. The overall reduction in number is greater even than the scale of the EU's imports before the introduction of the ban. The authors of this study nonetheless note that some alternative trade routes have since opened up and that remaining trade flows have been redirected, mainly towards developing countries around the tropical belt. They also recognize that some trade in wild birds will have been driven underground by the adoption of the EU ban. The second constraint that I want to highlight is that presented by WTO law. And here I simply want to make a rather categorical observation. If anyone has more detailed questions, my colleague and friend Gracia Marin Duran is in the audience and she will be happy to answer questions on this point. I don't think she knew that in advance. Contrary to what is often claimed, including by people who should know better, WTO law leaves considerable autonomy to member states to adopt the kind of measures that we have been discussing. Slide 22, please, Lisa. These are the top 3 cases, in my view, that support that rather categorical proposition. Member states are allowed to enact carefully designed and applied non-product related production process methods, which relate to the way that products have been harvested or produced. Further, if they are carefully designed and applied, WTO law allows, or perhaps even sometimes requires, measures that differentiate between different countries with different development, financial, and trade needs. And it also permits measures that seek to strike a balance between different objectives where tensions arise. For example, between environmental protection and securing the livelihoods of local communities and indigenous peoples. Let me conclude. Earlier today, my sister gave the graduation speech at UCL Laws. She quoted a passage from Arundhati Roy, the Booker Prize-winning Indian author and political activist, and I'm going to repeat it here. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine a world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. In this spirit, this lecture has offered an occasion for me to think about how the EU can use law as an instrument to reduce its large and damaging global environmental footprint, including its land use and deforest footprint, which may now also be framed as a form of pandemic footprint. I've chosen to look at the EU because this is where I have a comparative advantage in terms of expertise, but also heightened moral responsibility as a consumer of forest and ecosystem risk commodities. For those of you who come from other rich or getting richer parts of the world, and I include China within this group, similar questions arise. If any of the UCL students in the audience decide to write their undergraduate or LLM dissertations on the steps being taken to reduce their own country's global environmental footprint, or indeed on the consequences within your countries of EU measures of this kind, I'd love to hear from you and to read your dissertations in due course. Thank you very much for listening to my very first Zoom lecture.
Thank you, Joanne. That was a real tour de force. I was thinking as you were kind of going through the various sections of your lecture that we often say to our environmental law students that environmental law is, complex and polycentric. And I loved how you brought together economics, law, science, politics at different scales and different levels. I really thought it was a masterclass. Thank you. We have some questions in the chat and some questions from the registration process. And what I've done at this point in time is sort of group them together and encourage anyone else who'd like to ask a question to put that into the chat, and I can monitor that. So the first sort of group of questions are about solutions, might be the sort of overarching theme. One person's asked whether shifting to a plant-based food system might be a very obvious solution. And I guess my take on that question is, I wonder if as lawyers, we often think of law as solutions to certain problems and whether there might be other types of solutions. And then another question was asking about what concrete measures governments might be able to take to reduce land degradation. And obviously you've spoken about the role of law in a very particular sort of way, whether there's anything else you'd like to add to that sort of solutions kind of theme.
Gosh, those are big questions. So let me take the plant-based food question first. You know, I have a researcher at the EUI, Rebecca Williams, who's possibly listening now, who's writing her PhD dissertation on the role of law in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from beef and dairy production. And of course, although she's starting looking at greenhouse gas emissions, she's also looking at the other environmental aspects, including deforestation and biodiversity loss. And it's opened my eyes actually to the issue of the role of beef and dairy in driving environmental degradation. And it's really interesting that the United Nations Environment Programme has a report out on zoonotic disease emergence, and it identifies the top 10 anthropogenic drivers of zoonotic disease emergence. And as you look through the list, beef appears everywhere. So there's no question that we all have to take seriously the challenge that our consumption of foodstuffs presents. And of course, it's a personal choice, and there are questions about what role law can play in relation to that. So one of the challenges that Rebecca is having in her dissertation is figuring out what role law can play in encouraging us to reduce our consumption. So I'm not going to try and answer that question. I just say she's in her 4th year, so watch this space. It'll be coming. Something
to look forward to. Maybe an annual lecture in a few years' time will be given by her. Thanks, Joanne.
On the solutions, I mean, I think I addressed quite a lot of that. So I think I maybe won't say so much more. I'll just make one point really, which is, you know, I think solutions are essential at all levels of governance. And one of the points that I'm trying to make in this lecture is that, you know, and actually the Zeitland and Overdivest article is really wonderful in making this point, is that you can arrive at solutions in an incremental way. You know, we're not going to get a big bang multilateral agreement on deforestation that is adequate to solve the problem. We've been trying for a long time. It's not going to happen. It doesn't mean you stop negotiating multilaterally, cooperating multilaterally. It doesn't mean that you stop trying to include protections for forests and other ecosystems within regional trade agreements and the like. But I also think there is a role for individual countries and individual regions in the way that I've tried to describe in relation to the EU. Partly because in the case of the EU, it's powerful, so it's a big market rather, so it can make a difference. But partly because I've argued in the past that there is a possibility for the EU to play a role of being a contingent unilateralist, you know, actually adopting regional regulation to change the background in such a way that some of the blockages that exist in international negotiations can be overcome. You know, one thing companies like less in regulation is fragmented regulation. We're seeing this in relation to climate change more and more. So I really do believe that there is a role for incrementalism and action at all levels of governance, including within individual states.
And on that last point, I'm just thinking of your other work on climate change and aviation, and whether you're seeing whether there are parallels to be seen in terms of the EU's possible A, kind of responsibilities, and B, responses, whether you're seeing parallels in those two places.
So I think from what I can see, there's some parallels, but the stories are different. So the story with aviation is that the EU acted unilaterally to include, or at least proposed, didn't in the end do it, but proposed to include aviation emissions within the scope of its emissions trading scheme. that had the effect of galvanizing regulation at the international level within the International Civil Aviation Organization. Now, that is what the International Civil Aviation Organization has done is not yet adequate. So we're going to still see this kind of interplay. From what I see within timber and timber products, and I take this from the Zeitland and Over Divest article rather than work I've done myself, is that we're seeing a different model. We're seeing the model of what they call, drawing on Oren Perez's work, they call ensemble regulation. We're getting a sort of overlapping assemblage of different initiatives, public, private, different levels of governance that are coming together to form something that looks more promising than what we would have expected at the beginning. It's not an all-encompassing solution, but it's moving in the direction, small pieces moving in the direction of creating something which is more whole.
Three sort of questions loosely based around actors, I guess governance and actors. So Nick, one of our former students, hi Nick, is asking about the WTO. And my feeling was that what you were saying, and I may misrepresent you here, Joanne, is that the WTO isn't a sort of bar to measures being taken along the lines you were talking. And I think Nick's question is much more about whether there is a kind of a positive role for the WTO to play. We also had another question on the WTO and whether it, because of certain cases, so tuna, dolphin, etc., whether it has, it can create a sort of chilling effect for legislators who might want to do or take very positive steps in this sort of area. So they're the two WTO questions. There was another actors question on, I guess, which actors should we be focusing on in terms of responses? Is it better to look at states, or should we be thinking about NGOs?
So on the last point, one of the really promising things about the voluntary partnership agreement model is its inclusive nature. And we hear those phrases, inclusive, deliberative, stakeholder, all the time. But a lot of work has been done to suggest that there is at least the beginning of something positive there, where different actors are being brought together to talk about possible solutions on the ground, including actors which are quite difficult to get to the table in certain circumstances. So smallholder farmers, for example. And so it's incredibly easy to criticize in this area, but I do think there is something very promising about the voluntary partnership agreement approach. It's a lot, it's extremely challenging, it's extremely slow. There are some issues around enforcement and so on, but I don't think there's any alternative but to try and establish a sort of multi-actor approach of that kind. On the WTO, to Nick, in a sense, I would say it's a good question, but for the time being, I think I'm going to be happy if the WTO, if it is understood and true that the WTO is simply not a constraint. And by constraint, I would also say that it doesn't have the kind of chilling effect that the second question refers to. And I do think there is a chilling effect that is taking place. I'm not sure I want to blame the WTO for it. If you look at, for example, the shrimp turtle report, at the end of the report, the appellate body says, now, we just want to tell you what we haven't decided here. We haven't decided that countries can't take measures to ensure protection of the environment. But of course, the report has been misinterpreted and misread time and time again. I referred to Gracia Marin-Duran earlier on in the lecture. Gracia and I were asked to do a little report for an NGO, the Environmental Justice Foundation, about the WTO compatibility of, I can't even remember exactly what it was now, but having IMO numbers, permanent IMO numbers attached to fishing vessels to prevent evasion of fishing legislation. And one of the reasons we were asked to write that little report was because the European Commission had argued that it would be WTO incompatible to do so. And when we looked at it, it seemed very clear to us that that wasn't the case. But time and time again, governments use the WTO to justify not doing what they don't want to do. which is why, in a sense, today I kind of presented it in the way I did. Increasingly, I think it's just a question of we've got to get out the main message, because WTO lawyers, and to some extent I'm one of them, we like to get really caught up in the sort of the fine print. I do think the WTO committees can play a role in well, again, go back to Zeitland and over to Vest, in diffusing good practice in relation to environmental protection. So, when countries introduce regulations, legislation, other countries often raise concerns about them in WTO committees, such as the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. And that can serve as a forum for countries understanding each other's legislation and regulatory initiatives better. So I think that, if I was trying to find what positive function can the WTO play, that would probably be my best answer. But as I say, the main thing is to understand that if measures are carefully designed and applied, they can be WTO compatible. And we're learning increasingly more about what it means for a measure to be carefully designed and applied.
Thank you. A couple of questions here about animals and animal welfare. And actually, interestingly, both questions, one in the chat, one as part of registration, referencing the culling of the millions of mink in Denmark. So the first question is about, I guess, the interface between animal rights and human health, environmental law, and how those rights might interact, and whether there is a space to put the interest of the animals ahead of a potential risk to human health. And then the second is about intensive farming generally, linked to that issue in Denmark, and whether the EU should be engaging in efforts to reduce the number of factory farms that it has.
So, I guess the sort of positive message, I suppose, would be that I think there are potential synergies between efforts to protect the environment, to prevent deforestation, to prevent zoonotic disease emergence, and animal welfare. And I think the mink example is a very clear example of that. Many countries in Europe had already banned intensive mink farming, precisely because of the risk of zoonotic disease emergence. And I don't imagine that Denmark will be inclined to allow this industry to rebuild for precisely the reasons that we're seeing now. So I do think, actually, that the increase in public awareness of the role of intensive farming in promoting the transmission of zoonotic diseases is going to be helpful from an animal welfare point of view. Having said that, I think we also have to be a little bit culturally sensitive about this. I mean, people have their own political priorities and agendas, and one of the people asking the question may have as the political priority or agenda the protection of animal welfare, which is a completely legitimate and sensible position. But there are, of course, other possible political positions, and we're involved in a political contest for power here. And when it comes to animal welfare, I think there is also increasing awareness that, for example, wildlife farming in China, while it's very easy to say, as the Chinese government has to some extent, we need to shut it down, it poses a risk, it also supports many, many millions of people's livelihoods, and also cultural preferences for certain types of food and medicine. So I think we have to recognize the possibilities. But I think if we want to use zoonotic disease emergence as our rationale, it will take us so far, but probably not all the way that people who want to absolutely prioritize animal welfare would like to go. So one could imagine farms, whether it's livestock or wildlife, which are properly regulated in order to contain the risk of zoonotic disease emergence, and which animals are treated in a humane way. That might be enough for some people, but not enough for other people. So it's a very important and interesting question, and one that's, again, really been put on the political agenda as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, and another layer of complexity, I guess, as well. I'm very conscious of time. It is now 7 o'clock, and I have a long list of other questions, both here and in the chat. But this is, I think, a testament to how great that talk was. I mean, I certainly sometimes approach these online events with a real sense of, oh, it's yet another thing. But I will say, Joanne, I found that so stimulating and so enriching, and I'm sure that everyone else listening in did too. So thank you very, very much. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And a special thank you to Lisa Penfold, who's our events manager. Those at UCL know that Lisa basically runs the faculty and makes everything go ridiculously smoothly. And we wouldn't have had this brilliant event but for Lisa's support. So thank you, Lisa. Joanne, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all the questions from the audience as well. It's a shame I can't be with you all to go off for a glass of wine next.
We'll do it at some point in the future. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Take care. Bye-bye.